Good afternoon. From two guys from Bensonhurst and another in Tom Volpe. Thank you. We thank Tom and Anita for this lecture series and thinking enough of us and this story to include us. And Richard Relkin, is he here? He did an amazing job in taking an hour-and-a-half film and carving it down so that we could see the piece we saw today. He did a wonderful job. Rob Oliva and his staff, we thank them greatly for pulling this together for us. And the whole of the St. Francis community. I'm alive today because of the Italian people. I'm alive today because of the Italian people. Over and over again, we heard this from survivors. Vince, who's a noted humanitarian and Holocaust historian, introduced me to all the people that he was meeting, starting with the lectures that he would give around the region. And I, through him, kept meeting more and more of these survivors. And they wanted to tell their story. They wanted people to know how much the Italians had done for them. So I like to say that this film was compelled by those survivors who wanted their stories told. And if you're fortunate to see the rest of this film, because it is a much broader film, and a wonderful film, we take 3-4 survivors back to Italy to meet with the people who were responsible for them and their families surviving. But they just represented scores and scores of survivors who wanted their story told. And I think Vince can tell you where he first found this story.
Well, I can't thank you enough for having us here, and I really feel honored to be here. And I was real familiar with the Holocaust story for many, many years. And in about June 1995, I get a phone call from a man named Walter Wolf of blessed memory. I was involved with the Holocaust group he had met with, and they told him to call me and tell me his story. And this is what he said. Well, I don't have much of a story, he told me. I was born in Germany, I went to Italy, and then I came to the United States after the war. And I said, well, Walter, how did you get to Italy? And basically, after about an hour and a half, he had this amazing story. And like many of the Italian survivors, in the pecking order of survivors, they didn't speak much because they hadn't suffered like so many others. But after his wife died, he had promised her that he'd start sharing the story. And then, after he tells me this remarkable story, he says, I know 5 other people with similar stories. That's when I knew I hit a home run. When you look at this stuff from a historian and see first primary source material, and you have somebody who's alive, this is incredible. And at that point, I decided I have to make a documentary. So needless to say, it's a long project. I didn't think it'd take 20 years of my life. I don't know if I would have done it if I knew then what I know now, but I did it. And then, of course, Vince was so important because right after Walter died, thank God I had taped him, he said, we got to get these other people on tape. And Vince was able to tape, provided he paid for the first taping we did of the group that never made it to the documentary because they all died. But we have all these incredible interviews, which are eventually going to go on our website. And then, of course, the story became very complicated. I met a woman named Elizabeth T. that became part of our group, and I helped her. She wrote a book called It Happened in Italy, and a wonderful man named Joe Perella saw Elizabeth's book and contacted us and said, we have to do something about this. And the rest is history. And it was prominent Italian Americans who contributed large sums of money to tell this story. And you have to understand who Gino Bartali was. For American audience, I say there isn't a single sports figure that represents Gino Bartali. The best you could do is a composite of Babe Ruth and Michael Jordan. That's how big a superstar he was. So you understand what he had to lose. And what's so compelling about Bartali is his faith. And we went on this journey. We didn't know what we were going to find. We didn't know who was still alive. And what you saw was the last group that still had memory and was still alive. And we put together this very complicated story, which is an imperfect story because 20% of the Jews in Italy didn't survive. And remember, it was Mussolini who brought the Holocaust to Italy, put these laws in there to ingratiate himself to Hitler. It's just a terrible story. But yet, if we don't tell the story of those Italians who risked everything, then the murderers have a victory from the grave, because they were convinced that no one would help these people, especially the Italians who had been their main allies, and the Germans looked at them as traitors now, and they were brutally treated. So the risk these people took was incredible. You find a Jew in a village, they'll destroy the whole village. So in my opinion, I thought this story had to be told. We're familiar with Schindler's List, which is a remarkable story, how over 1,200 Jews were saved by Schindler. In Italy, over 32,000 Jews were saved. And we don't know how many more were saved from the Italian areas of occupation. But this story had to be told. And yet this was a compelling story because of the individuals. And what I found so amazing was the story of those religious. Sister Josephina's story just blew me away, that only the Pope could get me out of here. and Giorgio Goldenberg's story, thank God we found him in Israel, was compelling. That nun is reciting prayers behind that SS officer. He would have shot her like a bug. He would have killed her on the spot. To me, the courage that these people exhibited, if we didn't put it on a screen, they'll die forever. And the idea was to give even younger people the idea, even in the worst of times, there's goodness. And I think the most important thing, and everyone has an answer for this in their own hearts, why did they do it? And I think the testimony of Pacifici, who was the president of the Italian Jewish community in Rome, and how his grandfather and father, I think that it's riveting. Again, this is an imperfect story because of the fact that not everyone survived. But when you saw what happened everywhere else, the fact that so many people did survive is a testament to individuals who had the courage to care.
Yeah, you met on this brief film Charlotte. Well, we took Charlotte a little out of context here, but Charlotte went back to visit the city, the town in Italy, where she and her family, and as she describes it, many, many other Jews were being hidden. This was the situation. This was a conspiracy of the whole town. They all participated. Think about it. If one person mentions to a fascist policeman or an SS, everyone would have been shot. But these townspeople, and we show the reunion, they were not unique in their courage in protecting these Jews and other refugees. They felt compelled to do it. We found that there was a humanity. There was, as Giorgio said, they didn't understand why you would kill someone for the religion. The Italians just couldn't understand that. At the same time, you have the Italian character that says, nobody's going to tell me what to do. The Germans are going to tell me to hand over somebody that I don't think should be handed over. I would use some signs in my hands that the Italians might give you. And it was that part of the character that just wouldn't tolerate it. And so what impressed us about the story, because we knew enough about Holocaust stories, that everywhere there were beautiful people who were saving and protecting, and there was people in the attic and in the basement. You've heard this. How often had you heard stories of these mass whole towns conspiring to protect people? And we thought that was part of the uniqueness of this Italian story.
Yeah, well, it's interesting as we're still not understood in America 100 years after we've come here. They'll never understand that we're a regional people. When I was a kid in Brooklyn, when we asked among Italians, what are you? We weren't thinking American. We were thinking, what region are you from? Are you Napolitano, Abruzzese, Siciliano? The fact they're Italian or a regional people, as opposed to, and not only that, we're suspicious of any kind of laws. Even under Mussolini's dictatorship, and in many cases thought laws were there to be evaded, as opposed to the German way of thinking. The Germans never understood it. Even Kesseling was told by one of his underlings, how are we going to deal with these people? How can this country run like this? He said, you have two choices, shoot them all or try to live with them. See, this is what I find so compelling. These brave people were the unsung heroes of the Holocaust. And at the same time, I always remind people that 20% didn't make it. But when you look at the total picture, you have to tell the whole story, and you see that in the documentary. To me, many of these people were simple people. Many of them were contadini, you know, but they had an education of the heart. And yet, many of these Italians were ecumenical before the word ever existed. This is what I heard from Jews. And the other thing, the stories of the policemen warning them, etc. So you just saw snippets here, and I don't want to take too much more time. I just want to say that if you all get a chance, please see the whole movie. And it wouldn't have been done without him financing the first part to get these people who never die that are going to go on the website, our website. And of course, Joe Perella seeing the importance of this story and creating a group that put this beautiful story. Again, we ended up in Assisi. We didn't know where we were going. I'd like to tell you that we intentionally went to Assisi. That's not what happened. That's not what happened. We had a producer. We went back and forth and back. It's another story for another day. We went where the story took us. And eventually, Bartali, now I knew about Assisi, but this is what happened. You know, Bishop Niccolini, many of these people have been honored by the Israeli government, Yad Vashem. But most importantly, for us as Catholics and us as Italian Americans, we have to know this story, because this is a piece of who we are. And this is something that cannot be taken from us. This is something, there's no but. So all I could say is, if you have a chance, we have a website, ItalyandTheHolocaust.org, that my daughter put together. We also have education programs now, lesson plans in English and Italian. And now, of course, we're fortunate that the Italian language teachers realize how important this movie is for Italian language students. And they're starting to show all of it now. And I'm wonderful that some of these people did it gratis. And I'm happy to say that the 20 pages.
All right, Vince, we're going to open up to some questions. Let's give both Vinces a round of applause.
Well, that's a great question. Let me just say this. What makes this story so compelling, while Mussolini was in power, not one Jew was deported. But because Mussolini has set up the framework for deportation, once the Germans came in, most of the fascisti did not cooperate. But unfortunately, enough of them did cooperate that 20% of the Jews didn't survive. That's why this story is so intellectually honest. Most of them refused to cooperate. The other, unfortunately, some of them did. But many of the fascisti really, they disappeared, but they weren't going to help the Germans, because people don't understand, most of Italy did not have a place in their heart for Nazi Germany. And most of them did not cooperate. Unfortunately, those that did were involved in deporting 20% of the Jews.
Let me add this. Now, you were introduced to Degiaimo, which was a Jewish organization that reached out globally to bring money in to help the Jews. Now, we have read, and it's been reported, that there is no way that the fascists didn't know what was going on. All the phones were tapped, people knew what was going on, and they never interfered. Now, why they did it, but it was recognized they knew what was going on, and they just kept their hands off. And so everything here is complex and layered, but that's part of it.
Thank you. Next question from the middle of the auditorium.
Yeah. How would you assess the role of Pius XII?
You know what's interesting? My producer was thinking that we'd find the secret role one way or the other, positive or negative. Because we did this open-ended, which meant whatever we find goes on the screen, we didn't find anything regarding Pius XII, except Pius XII is a complicated story. Remember, up until 1963, today's generation doesn't understand that when the Pope died in 1958, all over the world, Jews thanked him for what he had done, etc., etc. And then in 1963, a play called The Deputy came out. And it was put together by the NKVD. And of course, the most successful disinformation, character-destroying plot of the entire Cold War was the communist destruction of the Pope. And after that came out, that's when all of this came up. It's a complex story because those who say he should have spoken out don't understand that the bishops in Netherlands spoke out, and the first thing they did was send all baptized Jews to be executed. So we'll never know the whole answer. There's one group you can never convince that he did anything good. There's another group that will never believe that he did anything that he did everything right, and those you can't. The way it's done, there's no minds being changed. One book that you should read is called Church of Spies. It just came out about 2 years ago. The person who wrote it is an expert. He's a Jewish author. He's an expert on intelligence. And in this story, which they made into a National Geographic documentary called The Pope and the Nazis, you see the difficulty involved and the fact that the Pope was involved in attempts to murder Hitler. So again, this is a very complicated situation. It's a complicated story. People come to this with their minds made up. No matter what you tell them, they're not going to change their minds. On the other hand, people feel that he did everything right, not realize that they maybe made some mistakes. That's the story.
I will offer this. I don't think past us and past the next generation, anyone will be able to really sort through, was it good, was it bad? There was the bad part. Certainly, none of this went on in Italy without the sign-off of the Pope. You know, cardinals didn't just step up and want to go contrary to the fascists and the Germans without having some kind of sign-off from the Pope. And oftentimes it's reported that when they went to the Holy Father and they said, Holy Father, you know, here's the opportunity, I need your permission. His response is documented. His response was, let your conscience be your guide. He thought he can maintain neutrality. It's very complex. He was not Churchill. He was not Roosevelt. He wasn't, it appears, to be a man for the times. He wasn't what they called a war pope. His predecessor was considered a war pope, and his predecessor had spoken out early against the Nazis. Gino Pacelli was a diplomat. He was a lawyer. He was a totally different kind of person with a totally different view. So just to make it simple, because it can go on forever, we'll never know. There'll always be both sides giving their arguments. But Vince is right. He was praised to high heaven. They planted 600,000 trees in Israel as a thank you to him when he was still alive. Anyway.
We have a question from here.
I just want to know where I can view the whole movie.
Well, the movie's on Netflix. The movie's available on Amazon, PBS. It's a great DVD. I didn't bring any. Our foundation has a bunch of them, but I didn't bring any today intentionally. How much could I bring along on a railroad? So it's a high quality film. We came within an eyelash of a nomination for an Academy Award. It's a theatrical documentary. You could see how well made it was. A tremendous amount of money was spent on it, and the idea was to make the story interesting. The music is compelling. Isabella Rossellini and Robert Loggia, who this was the last thing he did before he became ill. It's a beautiful movie. Again, you'll see the intellectual honesty in the movie because we told everything. We talk about the 20%. We talk about people. So everything's there for you. Any other questions?
Yes, right here.
What part of Italy was actually occupied by the Nazi and which part was basically run by the fascists historically? And was there a difference? I think there would have been in terms of, you know, hiding the Jews and ensuring they could live as opposed to sending them over to the Nazis.
Answer that question?
Please, you're the expert.
They invade Sicily in July 1943. And to make it short, they get to Rome in June 1944. And then it took forever. So basically, most of Italy south of Rome was freed in less than a year. But Italy north of Rome took forever. The German army in Italy was never really defeated, even though on April 25th it was pretty well over. So Italy north of Rome is where a lot of these things took place. But remember, those south of Rome, they were still alive, so when the Allies came, there were Jews allowed to be saved. So that's where it happened. So that's pretty much it.
So the Nazis occupied
Italy was invaded by the Nazis on September 8th, 1943. Italy switched sides, and the Germans were ready. They immediately invaded. And unfortunately, most of the roundups occurred in the north. Remember, real quickly, In Rome, on October 16th, 1943, they rounded up approximately 1,400 Jews that night. There were still 10,000 Jews left in Rome. What happened? Where'd they go? 5,000 went into private homes. The other 5,000 went into religious buildings of many sorts, including convents, including Vatican buildings. This is very, very important to know. This is a mixed story, but not to emphasize the courage of these people who save people. Saving a Jew when you risk your whole family being executed, a whole village destroyed. That's so important. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much for this wonderful film, because the story that you're telling here came through that the Italian people follow the law of their soul and do the right thing. And how do you, and this is especially relevant in nowadays environment, how do you encourage young people to do more of the storytelling and collecting this? Because I can think of these in China for the Cultural Revolution stories, because if we don't tell more of these, we will lose them. And when all the young people are, a lot of encouragement in STEM and all these things, but I think the storytelling, how do you encourage them, and how do you encourage them to find resources and stuff like that?
Well, can I answer that?
Please.
Unfortunately, the Holocaust is being de-emphasized in public schools. In my opinion, the last hope of keeping this story alive is the entire Catholic school system in the United States. This film should be shown in every Catholic school, from grades 8 up. Every Catholic school should show this film. Why? Because this story is not going to be told anywhere else. In the world of public schools, if you get Gino Bartali mentioned, that's the story.
I think it should be told in all the religious schools.
But I deal...
Hard when they respect
I
others'
understand,
religion.
but I deal with the reality of it because I do teacher conferences all the time. I go all over the country at my own expense because I feel a moral obligation to tell this story on 2 levels. Number one, the survivors who gave me all their rights. People on their deathbed who I told them I would keep the story alive. And the only problem is it's so difficult to get this told in other religious schools. There's so much politics involved. The politics of the Holocaust in public school is beyond belief. It's hardly being taught anymore, which is why we made this movie, because it's so attractive, and the website has a trailer, and the whole idea is to show clips. I can tell you this, the fact that one part of this story is being told in public schools is because I've talked to hundreds of teachers about this, and they love part of it. But as far as I'm concerned, all religious schools should tell this story, whether you're Catholic or not. Why? Because it shows the importance of faith. That's the key to this story, that Bartali was a man of faith. I mean, these are his words, they're not my words. What made him so strong? My friend Walter Wolf of blessed memory. Walter, how could you have survived? This devout Jew said, without my faith, I never would have been able to survive. Every Jew I spoke to who survived in Italy, the foundation of their survival was based on their faith. And that's the message that it's difficult to get out today when you have basically an anti-religious environment in this country right now. It is what it is, regardless of what you are. Go ahead.
My initial question was going to be about whether there was a difference between North and South with respect to the attitude of members of a town, or whether the size of a Jewish population or its social integration in a town affected the attitudes of people towards surviving. You mentioned that there was a difference in occupation, and most of this happened in the North. So my secondary point is a recommendation that you try and work with the Museum of Jewish Heritage and 16th Street. And I do think that there would be an interest in the yeshivas in New York. And I want to applaud you for doing this.
Well, I'd like to respond to the question. For many Italians, the Jewish population in Italy, you look at the general population, was under about 45,000 prior to the war, and when the war began, you're talking about approximately 40,000. So most Italians had little knowledge of what Jews were, except it didn't make a difference because they knew it wasn't their religion. You have to understand that Jews in Italy were the founding fathers of modern Italy. The Risorgimento had many Jews involved in it. They were the founding fathers. So the Jewish presence in Italy, though small in number, was very big in impact. They were well known in the military, the science fields, etc. So they knew who they were. But many people in Italy, especially in the South, they didn't really think too much of what a Jew was. And even those in the north that had a better idea, it was interesting because most of the reactions were similar. Most people who took risks, they did it for their own reasons. Other people didn't take risks, but they didn't turn people in. This is the difference between Italy, many parts of Italy and Eastern Europe. They knew who the Jews were, and the Germans only knew as much as the Italians were willing to divulge. And plus, many of the Italian Jews were Italian. They looked like me. I mean, they were Italian. And the German Jews, you got to remember, 10,000 German Jews, the German Austrian Jews came into Italy. Italy was the only country to let these people in before the war began. That's why it's such a complicated story. Mussolini's trying to deport people, he's letting Jews in. Most Italians were open-minded in their religious beliefs. You would find that they weren't as doctrinaire as many American Catholics were at the time. Italians had because of their history, they had a much, like Giorgio Goldberg said, they didn't care who we were. And I think this is important because if we don't tell this story of humanism, the bad guy wins. The bad guy wins. Again, it's an imperfect story because there wasn't 100% survival. And I appreciate your suggestions. I thank you.
And one of the things we'd like people to take away from this film is that if you are not indifferent, things can be different. If you care, things can be different. And we also hold this film up as showing that there's an alternative to cooperation and collaboration with an enemy. And we think the Italians showed one of the approaches of not working with and collaborating with the enemies.